As for the continuation of our report, we are now going to discuss about I Hear America Singing by Walt Whitman. But before that, let's delve a little about Whitman's life. Whitman was a father of free verse who revolutionized American poetry and invented a new poetic form. He was a part of the transition between transcendentalism and realism, incorporating both views in his works. At the age of 11, he was pulled from school to help his family in printing industry. Thus, he was self-taught. At the age of 17, he started to teach, and in 1841, he started his journalism career. Meanwhile, in 1848 until 1855, he started his biggest work, which is The Leaves of Grass, that had 7 editions of this book. During the Civil War, he produced a small book of poems called Drum Taps. In 1870, he also published 2 new collections of poems called Democratic Vistas and Passage to India. His works are known as a bard of democracy because the poems are based on the notion of universal brotherhood. And in 1873, he got partially paralyzed and he moved to New Jersey until his death. In his lifetime, Leaves of Grass was considered by many people to be a disgraceful book, but when he died, he acquired the name the Good Gray Poet as if America is ready to accept him as a poet. Now, let's move on to the literary style of Whitman. Whitman is not only the greatest poet of America, but also one of the greatest poets of the world. Democracy is the keynote of his poetry. In his poetry, we can find newness. As a revolutionary poet, he gives voice to the new urges and aspirations of man in the age of science and democracy. His contribution to American poetry is praiseworthy, and he earned wide acclaim for his technical innovations. As technical innovator, Whitman is the greatest practitioner of verse libra. In 19th century, he anticipated some of the most vital and daring technical innovations of the 20th century. He does not write in meter but in condensed verse. As for the language and diction, he freely used words taken from trade, commerce, and business of America. He imported words from foreign languages. He actually did not hesitate to introduce slang, vulgarism, and colloquialism into the language of his poetry. His peculiar style is admirably suited to his purposes. In short, his language is fresh and original. As for the words and lines, he often made free use of words from factories, farms, and trades. He freely coins new words and distorts and adapts words from other languages into his own uses. The individual line is how his poetry shows independent entity wherein it is complete in itself. This independence is especially noticeable in the catalogues where image after image and lines after lines. Next, we have the free verse or the versification. Whitman's poetry has no regular pattern of rhyme or meter. It is as unconventional as his language. He was the first poet to exploit the possibilities of free verse. This is a rare compatibility between his forms and his themes. He employed some of the traditional devices as assonance, alliteration, repetition, inverse word order, parallelism, and etc. Though his poems are free from measured foot, but it's filled with a rhythm of its own. The movement of his verse is the sweeping movement of great currents of loving people. Next is catalog. Most of his works contain list of something, or a list of people, things, or attributes. We also have imagery and symbolism. Whitman's poems have a number of recurring images. At each repetition, the image gathers more meaning until it will become as a symbol. His major images are the grass, the sea, the bird, the celestial bodies, and the like. In fact, Whitman was a symbolist before symbolism became a conscious movement in Europe. Thus, his poetry is highly symbolistic. He used symbolism to communicate his apprehension of the mystery of the universe. These symbols are flexible and ambiguous. Let's now read the poem I Hear America Singing. I hear America singing, The varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat. The deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song. The plowboy's on his way in the morning or at noon intermission or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother or the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her, and to none else. The day what belongs to the day, at night the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. This time, we're going to analyze this poem under the new literary criticism. The major themes in this poem are freedom, growth, and dignity. The poem speaks about the freedom that people enjoy in America. Throughout the poem, everyone has their own song, which means everyone is important. Every working people contribute to the growth of America or any country they live in. I Hear America Singing is not a formal poem. It does not have a set meter or a rhyme scheme. Instead, it is written in free verse, with a single stanza of 11 lines. It doesn't mean the poem is all over the place. These lines are very repetitive in structure, with the first 8 all listing different professions, and the final 3 going into a bit more depth regarding the character of these various songs. The lines vary in length, though, and there is no real way to group them together beyond noting this sort of conceptual ideas. None of this is incidental, but is in fact meant to feel free flowing and exciting. Like all of Whitman's poem, I Hear America Singing is not written in any specific meter. The number of syllables varies widely across the poem, from 12 syllables in line 11 to 23 in line 5. Though the poem has a strong rhythm, that rhythm is not secured by meter. Instead, it comes from Whitman's use of devices like anaphora and parallelism. I Hear America Singing thus departs from one of the central traditions in English poetry, a tradition that dates to the Middle Ages. It finds a way to make a poem poetic without using accentual syllabic meters. I Hear America Singing presents an idyllic and idealized vision of American life. The poem moves from the city to the country, from the shore to the sea, introducing the reader along the way to all different works, from farmers to shoemakers to housewives. Traveling through these places and professions, the speaker gradually builds a portrait of America as a place where people find joy and fulfillment in productivity and honest labor, even if that labor is not typically sung about in poetry. And while the poem takes care to emphasize the dignity and pride of each of these workers in their own right, it also affirms that the workers' various songs come together to form the sound of America itself. The speaker's list of jobs cuts across the whole of the United States, moving from rural jobs like plowing fields, jobs on shore, and jobs on the machinery, and it moves to urban job where professionals are making fashionable hats. The speaker even includes women alongside men, acknowledging the work they do as important contributions to American society. Though the speaker limits this work to domestic chores like sewing or washing, the fact that women are included at all is notable given that they were largely excluded from American political life at the time the poem was written. In the speaker's vision, it seems everyone gets to participate in creating the American song, no matter where their location and what class or gender they have. What's more, all of these different workers are singing. This probably isn't literally true, though perhaps a couple folks are indeed whistling away the hours. Instead, these songs are meant to represent the joy or pride these workers take into their labor. Americans, the singing suggests, derive a sense of pride and dignity from their productivity. When the speaker says, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else, this affirms the right of each worker to find value and even a sense of self directly in whatever work they do. It's also worth noting that music and song are often used in literature as stand ins for poetry itself. Part of the beauty of America, the poems thus implies, is that regular people are worthy of such song. You don't need to be some sort of mythical hero, beautiful damsel, or wealthy aristocrat for your life to be sung about. Yet, even as the poem celebrates self-sufficiency and individualism, through these varied carols, it emphasizes that all these workers together form the fabric of America. Each of these workers might be unique, but the poem is saying that what makes America is that they are all singing. After all, as the poem's first line announces, the speaker hears America singing, not many workers singing. For the speaker, America is a place where people get to have it both ways. They are at once individuals with personal freedom and independence, and part of a larger, harmonious collective. That, the poem ultimately suggests, is what America's song is all about. Now, let's discuss the poem line by line. The poem begins with the speaker declaring in the first person that he or she hears America itself singing. But in the second half of the line, the speaker notes that the song America sings is actually many separate songs, varied carols. The word carols is especially intriguing in this context, since it is often used for religious songs, and this is very much not a religious poem. The word suggests that Americans dedicate themselves to their country and their work with a passion and devotion that approaches religious faith. The speaker then moves on to note some specific songs being heard, those of mechanics, carpenters, and masons. The speaker will follow this pattern throughout the rest of the poem, celebrating working Americans whose lives are humble and whose work is often difficult and physical. The fact that their songs are cheerful and strong highlights the speaker's broader vision of America as a place where people find joy and fulfillment in their work. And as the poem describes these people, the speaker notably avoids using much fancy, literary language. Instead, the poem's tone is casual and conversational. While it's certainly possible that all these mechanics, carpenters, and masons are literally singing to pass the hours, it seems more likely that this singing is a metaphor. On the one hand, it represents the pride and joy Americans take in their work. It also is meant to reflect the way America, as a united nation, emerges from its individual citizens. Their unique songs blend into broader harmony, so that, as the speaker says in the poem's first line, America itself is singing. As the poem celebrates the diversity and richness of American life, it also tries to find a distinctly American music. The most obvious of these devices is anaphora. In the repeated phrase, I hear the profession or singing, which begins in line 3, this anaphora operates a little bit like mirror. It creates a sense of expectation in the reader, and it separates the poem's long lines into more manageable chunks. The poem also turns to other devices to guide the reader through its long lines and to make its simple language feel poetic. For example, almost all of the lines in the poem are end-stopped. This helps give the lines a sense of definition and integrity even as they expand and contract unpredictably. I hear America singing, the varied carols I hear. In this line, I hear repeats at the beginning and end, while America's singing and varied carols are just different ways to refer to the same thing, the various songs of American workers. Similarly, the poem is dense with assonance. Line 4 contains, for instance, repetition of the long A sounds, the short E sound, and the long E sound, and two variations of the O sound, like the mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The poem is thus not only about America singing, it makes itself into an example of a distinctly American music. In lines 5 to 8, the poem started with every profession singing that creates repetition and parallelism. It must be noted that most of the lines contain possessive pronouns that talk about the possession of each character mentioned by the speaker. It is worth noting how parallelism works on line 6, that the shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench, the hatter singing as he stands. It shows the opposite things that these characters do. However, by sitting and standing, it would create an illusion that it portrayed the different social classes or races of people in America. Each of these professions is being highlighted with the things they do on their own, on a simplest and direct way. Singing here doesn't mean that they sing while working. Maybe they do, but it talks more about how dignified and dedicated they are on their work. The speaker then moves to line 8 that highlighted how women in the society are stereotyped. Though women's jobs in these lines are more on domestic, but it creates a balance in the poem that harmonizes each of the line. Assonance and consonance in lines 5 to 6 are quite obvious with the repetitions of A and E sounds. Repetition in the structure of each idea, separated by or, also created parallelism, even though each idea is independent in self. Finally, in lines 9 to 11, there are no rhymes, but alliteration is utilized in line 9 in quick succession, such as the sound of H in each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The run on sentences in lines 10 to 11 highlighted a message of the day that what belongs to the day, as each person working America has their own ability, rights, and freedom to enjoy the democracy they have. Lines 10 to 11 is the only run on sentences we can find in this poem, which is rather ambiguous. It contrasts with the very clear end stops that mark the rest of the poem's lines as being discrete and grammatically complete, as independent and self sufficient as the proud American workers the poem describes. The run on in line 10 thus comes as a surprise, an interruption in the poem's established rhythm. It breaks the sense of sureness and containment that has otherwise characterized the poem. In this sense, it perhaps imitates the rowdy energy of the party of young fellows out at night. Like them, the run on is a little tipsy, a little unsteady. One might interpret this in several ways. On the one hand, it seems to admit a measure of insecurity and steadiness into the poem, otherwise so definite and confident in America. Maybe the run on suggests that the speaker is not quite as sure about America as he or she otherwise insists. On the other hand, the run on might seem like a relief after so many end stops. It gives the reader a sense of freedom and unpredictability. America may be a harmonious community, but it still contains space for rushes, energy, and unruly pleasures. The run-on is thus both suggestive and ambiguous. It's up for the reader to decide what it means. It is also important to focus the word strong as it represents the burning passion of each professional in a specific job they do. Again, it must be noted that singing doesn't literally mean that they are singing, but it is about the oneness and dignity. Line 11 could also present the unison voice of the people of America that creates oneness in their goal to strengthen it.